Alright, so switching from kind of the harvested forages to a little bit more grazing focused stuff. Jeff mentioned that they had done some energy supplementation work with the goats. And we decided to replicate that with sheep and raising lambs on pastures. This was one of the first grazing projects we did when I started. Obviously, here in the Northeast region and the Mid-Atlantic, we are in some densely populated areas, right? Very close to high populations. And so there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of people who are interested in doing more direct consumer marketing, having farm stores, shops, going to farmers markets, all those kinds of things. And for these folks, having a grass-based diet, a grass-based livestock operation helps with marketing or hits that niche that consumers might be looking for. And for these producers that are raising these kinds of operations, one of the things that's most limiting typically in a pasture-based system is energy, right? This is actually forage samples that were taken from July through September of orchard grass, mixed species pasture. And this is just showing the forage TDN percentage of two different pastures over time. But I'm going to layer in here the kind of average or estimated TDN requirement based on the NRC. This is if, because we were using lambs, this is a 4 to 7 month old lamb, around 70 pounds. And you can see that through this whole summer growing season, the pastures, which these are the pastures here at WMREC, this is from I think 2020, didn't meet the energy requirements of the lambs that were out there grazing. We wanted to look at what if we provide some supplemental energy, similar to what Jeff was talking about with the goats. Are we able to meet those energy requirements better and overall improve the growth and the health and the carcass characteristics of those lambs that are raised in that pasture-based system? There's a range here because this was over a couple of years, so we had 75 to 85, so 80 or so Katahdin ram lambs that actually came from a farm in Pennsylvania. So Jeff mentioned the struggle with university birds and getting animals from other research centers. And since I've started, we actually have basically worked with local producers and gotten the animals from local producers on a seasonal basis. These animals came down from Pennsylvania, and more recent years, we've had animals from here in Washington County. So it's been a nice win. They get free grass for the summer. We get free animals to weigh all summer and feed different things. So these animals were divided into kind of a pasture only system and a supplemented system. And they were both rotationally grazed across the same pasture, two halves of the same pasture. And the really only difference was that the supplemented lambs were fed whole barley at a rate of about 1 pound per head per day. So we had these little feeding troughs in the central area that we would have them have access to. We would go out and feed them once a day their little energy supplement. And so we were grazing these animals each year from around mid-June. These were spring-born lambs, so we had to wait till they were old enough to wean and on pasture through the end of September. Like Jeff said, this pasture was a mix. It's that perennial mix that they established: orchard grass, a little bit of red clover, white clover, a little bit of chicory, a little bit of alfalfa in there, a good mix. We collected forage samples every week. That's actually that graph I showed you previously. Those were the forage samples collected every week to look at forage yield and quality. And then every other week, we assess the lambs for body weight. So we could calculate average daily gain, body condition score, and then the matcha score to look at health or health issues. And then a few times during the growing season, we took fecal samples. So we could do some fecal egg count analysis. And then at the very end of the year, we actually ultrasound scanned the lambs to look at fat and loin depth to see if there was any difference there. So we weren't actually able to process them and get carcass samples like we had done with some of the goat work, but we were able to do some ultrasound scanning. So this start down here, this figure is just showing the body weight of the lambs over time. These two solid lines on the top are from the first year, 2020, and these two dotted lines out here from the second year. The reason there's a really big difference here is we had a lot of health issues that second year. We had a lot of parasite problems, we had some meningeal worm. We had much more health issues that year and actually ended up at the end of the season having to send it home a little bit earlier than we had planned. But if we look at the results, so the first year we didn't really see a big difference in their final ending body weight. But in the second year we did, and you can see that split here where the two groups started to separate from each other. The body condition scores were always higher for the supplemented lambs. Makes sense, right? They're getting an extra boost of energy, higher body condition score compared to the grazing only lambs. And then as far as like Camacho scores, there was a difference the first year, but they were all relatively low. And the second year, there wasn't a difference. They were all, you can see, a little bit higher on average. And the fecal egg counts, we did see a little bit of a difference again that first year, but again, they were all pretty low in the large grand scheme of things. And then the second year, you can see they were obviously a lot higher when we were having those health issues. So overall, the supplementation did end up putting a little bit of extra body weight on those lambs and increasing their body condition score a little bit. And then here's average daily gain. This is showing that it was significantly greater for both years for the lambs that were supplemented. Makes sense, right? A little bit extra body condition, a little bit extra body weight. They gained a little bit better. And to go along with that, there was no difference in the loin eye area, but they did have a higher back fat with those supplemented ones. And like Jeff said, average daily gain fluctuates a lot. You can see that here. These are our bi-weekly time points for average daily gain. And it looks like it's all over the place because of weather and other conditions and all kinds of variation. Do you have a question?
I do. Can you go back to the previous slide? So the fecal egg counts that are so different in that second year.
Yep.
What was the grazing management and how quickly did they return?
Can the people online do it?
They can't. So.
Okay, so there was a question about the fecal egg counts and the grazing management between the 2 years. Essentially, they were managed exactly the same between the 2 years. We were relatively understocked, so we did more of a simple rotational grazing than we did like more intensive. And with the places that the watering points were set up, and at that time, we basically were doing about a 5 to 7 day rotation. So they would be in the pasture for about a week and then move on to the next one. And depending on how quickly they were moved, I would say it was probably at least 30 days in between real grazings, but I feel from a parasite perspective, we would probably be a little bit longer than that. And actually, in recent years, we've had a longer rest period and shorter moves, and so we've had much lower parasite incidences. Yes, good point. Any other questions on that one? Yeah.
Could it be that in the second year, you had more eggs and larvae?
Yes, very much the case also. He said, also pointed out that during the second year, when you probably had more eggs accumulated, more parasite residual out there on the pasture, which is very true as well. Although there were lambs grazing before the first year of this study too, for a different project. So there was still lambs there every year, but it could have been a case where, like Jeff said, over time, they start to see it build up. Yeah, definitely, yes.
So another piece of the puzzle that doesn't really figure into the research is that a couple winters, because we had excess forage, we allowed our local production to bring dry use in, so they could have been also affected that. But we didn't manage those, we didn't look at those. I found the dead one. After that, I felt I ran a little too laser fair, so they brought it back. But we may have been also part of our problem.
Do you mind restating?
Yeah, Jeff mentioned that there was excess forage and we were using everything that was there at WMREC for a couple of winters. There was a local producer who was bringing in animals to graze during like the late fall or winter months and clean up the pastures, and maybe that could have been another source of infection. Yep. All right, just some concluding thoughts from that project was that internal parasites were not really a problem in 2020, but were much more prevalent for both groups in the second year. Overall, we did see that kind of growth and body condition advantage for the lambs that had that little bit of energy supplementation. And when you're doing the economic analysis on that, it really, of course, depends on the lamb prices and feed prices and all that kind of things. And it ended up playing out that the first year where we didn't have as much differences probably was not economical, but the second year where we had a much bigger difference between the two groups and land prices were a lot higher, it was more economical and it wouldn't have been a cost savings to actually supplement those things. A case by case situation on the economics, and you have to figure that out for your operations. All right, so switching from sheep to dairy heifers. This is the project that Jeff had referred to a little bit, talking about different management systems for raising pregnant dairy heifers. And for this project, our kind of rationale was, we know that heifer raising is often very high up there on the expense for farms, one of the most expensive for a lot of dairy farms in particular, but other farms as well. And if you look at the expense breakdown of what it costs to raise a heifer, feed, of course, is usually one of the largest percentages, if not always the largest percentage. And so what are some ways we can minimize feed costs? We were interested to see maybe we're not using our pastures to their full potential. We don't have a lot of land base in Maryland, but can we make the most of the limited land base that we have? And if we focus our investments on improving the pasture and put our time and efforts there instead of on mixing PMR and hauling PMR out to the heifers and the time and money that takes, are we able to see equal gains and growth, and how do those heifers perform both while they're being raised there, but then also, like Jeff said, as we're going into the milking herd, are there differences? And so we're looking at some different pasture management systems. So on one treatment, they basically had a continuously managed pastures. That's this whole area down here. The heifers had basically unlimited access to that whole area. They could go wherever they wanted as they please. Some areas looked halfway decent, especially further back in the pasture where they didn't go as frequently. Some areas obviously did not look quite as nice, especially near where the watering system was, where the feed wagon would come in, that kind of thing. And then on the flip side, we took these pastures up here and subdivided them and did a rotational grazing system with polywire. We basically, those heifers got just whatever they were grazing and a little bit of a mineral mix to make sure they were meeting their mineral needs. And then we took a couple of those pastures and added annual forages into the rotation. And then we also did some cross seeding with clover to try to boost the quality of the existing fall fescue pasture, which, as Jeff said, was largely probably Chapter 31 and if infected. Fescue, we haven't actually tested it, but it's been there for a really long time, and it's probably most definitely that's what it is. And these are also very hilly all around here. So just wanted to give an example of what the grazing timeline looks like when we were starting to incorporate these annuals into the rotation. This is just an example of one of the years from 2022. We had planted some winter annuals the previous fall and had been able to graze those a little bit. So we had oats, ryegrass, triticale that was planted the previous September, and then we started grazing that right around April 1st, and we were able to get a couple months of grazing from that good winter annual mix. While that was happening, the perennial pasture was having a nice long rest in the spring, and then they moved onto the perennial pasture. While they were grazing the perennial pastures, we went back into this winter annual area and planted summer annuals into that same area. So those were planted around the 1st of June or the first week of June, and we started grazing those around mid-July, and we're able to graze those through early September. You can see here they were on that Sudan grass cow feed mix. And got a lot of really good summer production from that. And then they were moved on to the perennial pastures again. The perk of this is that those perennial pastures had a nice rest during the heat of that summer. So they were very productive again, had a lot of forage there for grazing. While they were on that fall fescue pasture again, we went back into the summer annual area and planted back into the winter annuals. And then we started grazing those, not until December, they were a little bit later, and then we had oats getting planted, but we did that same oat, ryegrass, triticale, and crimson clover mix. And then you can see it only says 5 days here. That's because that's the year that it got freezing cold the week before Christmas, like abnormally cold for this area, and we didn't have a frost-free water source up there, so we actually had a lot of forage, or a decent amount of forage left. But we had to stop a little bit early because we weren't able to supply water to them. So we could have kept going. My goal was always to get to the new year, but I think we may have been able to make it better. So that's just an example of kind of what that grazing system looked like. Every other week, we went to the research farm and weighed and measured the heifers. So we were looking at body weight, body condition score, hip height, to track their frame growth. And then on opposite weeks, we were looking at the pasture. So we collected forage samples, again, for both yield and quality. We also did some fecal sampling, and I'm not talking a lot about the fecal sampling parts of these projects, but we've had several projects now where we've taken fecal samples, looked at parasite loads, and we're trying to see do these different grazing management strategies affect parasite load. And then we know grazing management can definitely affect it. We want to look at it under all these different types of scenarios. And then, like we mentioned, the calving, ease, milk production, breeding records, all of that we can track as these heifers enter the University of Maryland dairy herd, and we can see how they did on their first lactation and moving forward. So here's some of the results from that project. This is showing the forage quality. So here first, these two columns are control, the best continuous pasture and the TMR. And then on the right side, you have the different forages that the grazing treatment was grazing. And if you look at the two festy ones, they're actually very comparable in quality. So really where the continuous grazing is gonna get dinged is the yield, right? The production from that field was way less than the production from the rotationally grazed field. I have to had those nice long rest periods, but the quality was fairly comparable. And then you actually compare the TMR, granted this TMR was of course balanced for heifer ration, not for milk cow ration. But if you compare the TMR to those annual mixes, the annual mixes actually were equal or greater than in quality to the TMR that those dogs were getting. So some really good quality forage from those different annual mixtures. When we look at the growth of the heifers, there was no difference actually in either year in the body weight of the heifers, but we did see a higher body condition score. So this is the start of the study and the end of the study, and so we did see a significantly higher body condition score of heifers that were on getting the TMR and the continuous grazing systems. They lived in the lab of luxury. They had their food delivered to them every day, and they didn't really have to work for it. And it was a good quality TMR. And then they also had a slightly higher body or average daily gain for the control group. So they ended up being a little bit heavier and they ended up gaining a little bit more. But actually, for some of those heifers, they started to get a little over conditioned, maybe a little too much gain. This is again looking at kind of those average daily gains over time, and you can see again there's a lot of different things. This week was like unbearably hot, I think, and so you can see a lot of differences over time. If I layer in here the different things that the grazing group was getting, you can see that, for example, when they're on those nice summer annuals, they actually did really well and were outperforming the control heifers on their TMR. A lot of variability there due to weather, forage quality fluctuations. Like Jeff said, we were using bred heifers for this, so we had heifers entering the group as they were confirmed pregnant and then leaving the group as they were close to calving. And so there was that kind of fluctuation. And actually, Sarah and I, before she left, we had started looking at some adaptation data, like how long after those heifers are transferred into one of these treatment groups does it take them to like really start gaining? Like what is the adaptation period? And it was significantly higher for the grazing group because they're taken from a barn where they get fed TMR every day and they're thrown out into the pasture with these other heifers that they don't know and they're forced to graze and they only get a little bit of mineral. And so there was a little bit of an adaptation period there, but our conclusions from this project were that the final body condition and average daily gain was greater for the control group. There was no difference in the final body weight or the hip height. That tells us that those grazed heifers are still reaching adequate frame size prior to their first calving. And we think the real potential here is in the economic advantage. Even though that average daily gain was lower, they still had a good body condition and they still reached adequate size prior to calving. And we're still working on some of the economic numbers from this. We have 3 full grazing seasons of data now. And we think that there's a lot of potential that this grazing system is going to be much more economical than the TMR control. And like we said, we're continuing to follow them through first lactation. So we'll consider these different management systems while they were bred heifers, make a difference as they, join the milk. Are there any questions on that one? Or yeah.
Did you see difference in the breeding of the groups?
And the breeding, those are,
Yeah, conception breeding.
oh, yes. So the question was if there were differences in conception rates between the two groups. I don't have that data. I have that data, but I haven't looked at it yet. That's part of our following them through. The animals that were part of the study were already bred and confirmed pregnant. But we can follow those animals as they go into their first lactation and produce, and then as they get bred back again, we can see. But we haven't really teased out any of that follow-up data yet. We'll look at it. We will be looking at that.
I'm curious, do you have any strategies or plans to ease the adjustment for future groups so that they graze better, faster?
Yeah, so the question was, would there be a strategy to ease ease them into it in future years, so there was less of that adaptation period. I think there are things you can do. These heifers were in a full confinement system up until they were grazing, but if there was a small pasture that they had access to, getting them acclimated to a poly wire, not having different heifers entering and leaving the group all the time. There's different ways that you'd be able to manage it, to kind of use that adaptation. With the way that this was set up, we didn't have a good option for that, but I think, you know, on your own farm, there would be options. Yeah.
So just a few points. Number one, those are Holstein heifers that are a registered herd.
Yes.
So read here, they are not grazing genetics. They're, these babies, some of these girls were huge. Like 1,500 pounds. When they're going into calf. So they're not really either what we would consider adapted or bred for grazing. But the other point is we tried to be as real world as possible, because a farmer probably wouldn't have another pasture or whatever. He's gonna, when they get pregnant, dump them out. When they need to go into the barn, start on the pre-fresh ration, they're gonna do that. So we try to be as real world as possible. The other point that's gonna factor into that economics is we already had the grazing system there. There's gonna be a cost to set it up. And we'll look at that too. The unfortunate thing for Amanda and I is we don't have graduates. But we don't have somebody we just hand a flash drive to with a bunch of data on it and say, hey, when you get the R values, come back and see us. We don't have that option.
Yeah,
We don't either, Jeff, don't worry.
so for those online, Jeff brought up a few really good points for the adaptation thing. This is a real world scenario, right? And people are shipping animals around and taking them from the barn up to the pasture a lot of the time. So that in some way mimics what happens on a lot of farms. From the, what was the first one that we said?
Just that they're.
Oh, these were not, this was not a grazing based herd, it was registered purebred Holstein, so that may have factored in as well. And then the third thing was,
The cost of setting up.
oh, the cost, yeah, but the economic analysis would be different if you already have the grazing infrastructure there versus if you're starting from scratch. And actually, our plan is to run it both ways, to look at the comparison between the two, if you already have some grazing infrastructure, and to look at the comparison between the two if you have nothing. See how the cost would flush out under either of those, so. Yes,
So I've been custom grazing dairy outputs for quite a while. And to your point, it'd be great research to a transition period. Because they're dumb as a box of rocks, you put them out there, you're gonna have failure, you're gonna cause problems, but they're just. Have to put them in the sea of grass and they look at you like, what are we supposed to do with this? They immediately start stressing, going down, and then it takes a while when you get back up, they go, oh, we beat. What am I supposed to do without concrete, and isn't there a truck coming, and so if there's not a 2-week plan out, like what's a week transition? I have been told that it's dairy cows, it can be a 2 to 3 week transition of the rumen into grain feed, and without that, your results are not great. And it's unfair to compare the pasture system and something else without that transition. We lose body weight and there's all kinds of weird, just weird stuff. Oh, I'm moving uphill. I'm racing on a side hill. What's that all about? I'm usually flat. So that is a critical part of research, is getting that transition. Yeah, it'd be fun to do transition times, 2 to 3 weeks or 4 weeks. Just to see how much that throw the animals out. And it's the longest thing that all. That is not.
yeah, I think.
Super important just from an health perspective, because we have trained. I have treated more animals that their rumen is so much protein in the system. There is corn in the vessel that would come and do that. I think there's always some animal. He said these heifers really need to be on pasture to lose weight, to get fit, because they got too much corn in them. That whole perspective that changes your idea. When I look at a heifer that comes from a grease stall, they're definitely fatter. And then when they leave my farm, they're definitely leaner. But anyway, it's a great topic, one that we can't get beat up on, because right now, especially in the world, when you have large dairy, there's nutrient management issues, so animals could move off to pasture, there's an opportunity, a lot of CAFOs. But CAFOs, so much fun to stay in barns, hey, we got grazing up here, but without that transition pretty stressful.
Yeah.
This goes along with what we were saying. Back years ago, when I was at Virginia Tech, Poland was doing a study with lactating dairy cows. Now, the key is these cows had previously had access to pasture, so they knew what pasture was. So that was one key. The other key is, okay, the treatment was cows totally barn fed versus cows that transitioned between the pasture and the environment. And of course, the cows that were on pasture were getting some feed in the barn. But it was a little bit different, so that the total ration between the pasture and the supplement was comparable to what they would get if they were totally barn fed. And the idea of doing this study was pasture growth changes. How do we manage it and bring those cows back in the barn when we need to? The ration out on pasture was comparable to the ration when they were in the barn. And in doing that, we had no problem. They were able to maintain milk production. There's really no adaptation. They already knew what pasture was, and the rations were already balanced. So that, yeah, they're getting fresh grass out here, but it's being balanced, so it's comparable to what, basically what you did, what you have done. So I'll pat you on the back for you basically have two experiments there that are basically the same measure. At least on that one. Just throwing that on. Historical data.
The other thing we can do, again, when we want to go through the mountains research, is we did notice that in the spring, when we put heifers on that were on the pasture in the fall, they didn't have to learn anything. We could ferret out those individuals and look and see if there's a difference in their quote unquote adaptation. I'm not ready to go as far as to say that they train the other heifers to graze, but I am willing to look at, I'm willing to look at anything as long as I got somebody to help me. But so we didn't notice that when the heifers went out that were out in the fall, in the spring, they knew what to do. They didn't have to relearn that. They're not that stupid. But so the first year is data we can't do anything with, but the next 2 years we can look at heifers that were on in the fall and came back to us in the spring. And we do have those data points that we could look at and see if there is a marked difference. The other problem with collecting data every 2 weeks is you have too many data points, believe it or not. It does all come out in the wash, but when you see a dip in production, you get a little disappointed. But look at the end, look at the summary of the data, don't look at the data the day you're collecting. We do for reasons, but we found out a lot with the small ruminants because you go from a good rate of gain to 0.1 pounds per day, and you get, especially with goats, you get disappointed. So I'm not saying don't collect the data, I'm just saying don't fixate on the data until you analyze it all. Because that's another point that we found, especially because some of us come from a livestock background where we expect performance. And for 11 years, we did goat performance, and goats are really good at disappointing you on performance. From the perspective, again, from our paradigm, I'm not saying they're bad things to have, they're not, they're good. We have a lot of opportunity with goats, obviously, in our market, especially, but you have to retrain your mind about what you're looking for.
So I think, and I hope for the folks online, that this phone is actually serving as a second mic. So if someone has a question, raise your hand and I'll come over and bring my phone to you and you can speak into that. And then that way, hopefully Amanda won't have to try to restate.
Yeah, I was gonna say, there's no way I can repeat all of that.
It's a lot. So if anyone else has a question, I'm happy to bring a mic to you.
Alright.
Or later.
Yeah, later, we can do that.
I'll get to.
Alright, continuing on with the dairy stuff, we were also doing a little bit of work looking at using forages, not necessarily the grazing system, but as a harvested forage source. This is very common for a lot of dairies to harvest small grain silage in the spring. And we know that these winter forages can be a really high yielding and high quality source of feed, and actually a lot of dairies, some at least, are starting to shift away from alfalfa and more into relying more on small grain silage, because they can get a lot more tonnage in a single cutting or a single harvest compared to having repeated alfalfa harvest. And so there was some work out of New York actually, looking at what if we could provide additional nitrogen in the spring to boost the protein content of this winter silage. And then as a result of that, have to buy in less or feed less soybean meal or other sorts of protein if we're putting this in a TMR. And what they found was that this extra nitrogen in the spring, assuming that there was adequate fall nitrogen, there was not really any difference in yields from this extra nitrogen in the spring, but there was a difference in the forage protein content. And they found a range from around 9 up to 19% protein by adding this a little bit of extra nitrogen in the spring. And so we were really interested in this, and we actually had several dairy producers in the area that were really interested. And so Jeff and I decided to replicate this down here in Maryland and see if we found similar results. And so we decided to investigate the effect of that increased nitrogen fertility rate. And we actually did this both with and without sulfur, because we know sulfur is a really essential nutrient for protein formation in the plant. We wanted to see if that played a role as well. And then we looked at a whole host of different things: forage yield, forage quality, especially that protein, soil nitrate status, because we didn't want that extra nitrogen, of course, to be leaching through the soil profile. And then we also wanted to take this all the way to the end product and take that harvested silage, and after it was done fermenting, actually feed that in the diet of lactating cows and see if we could make an effective ration, or we could swap things out and make it economical. So I broke this one up into two parts. This first part is focused more on the field part, and then I'll talk a little bit about the feeding studies that we did after. So for this project, we used kale. It's very popular winter annual forage. This was done, the field part was done over 3 years. 2020 to 2021, 21, 22, and 22, 23. And so we have 3 years of data, and we have 2 locations. So we actually have data overload. We have a lot of data for this project. For the different treatments that we used, so we had a control with nothing added, a sulfur only treatment. Then we had a low nitrogen rate, so 50 pounds of nitrogen with and without sulfur. We had a medium nitrogen rate, 100 pounds with and without sulfur, and then a high nitrogen rate of 150 pounds, again, with and without sulfur. So those are the N low and high and medium and control treatments. Everything was fertilized every year in early to mid-March. By mid-April, of course, we can start to see some visual differences from that added nitrogen fertility as we're looking at across those plots. This is actually showing both locations. One was at the dairy, and one was here at the Western Maryland Research Center. We took the soil samples immediately before we applied the different fertility treatments, and then at harvest. So we wanted to see any nitrogen was, or any nitrates were lost. And then here is just, again, our handy dandy forage harvester, same flail mower setup, harvesting that forage at the boom stage in late April. Looking at the yields, we didn't really expect to see a big yield difference. We weren't varying planting date or fall fertility or any of the fall, getting those forages started in fall. We were only varying those spring fertility treatments. And so this is showing the 2 locations, the Central Maryland one on the left and the Western Maryland on the right. And then the gray bars are our 2 controls, and then it's the 2 lows in red, the 2 mediums in green, and the 2 highs in blue. As we move your way across, you can see we didn't really see any differences in yield, which we didn't expect. Yeah.
Is that yield fresh weight and
Dry matter, sorry, I don't have, yes, dry matter, this is dry matter yields, and we had right around 4 tons of dry matter per acre across both of our locations. Good high yielding harvest. Here's where it started to get really interesting. So this is showing the improved protein results from the first year of the project. And again, the 2 locations, same figure setup. And you can see we started to see this like really stepwise increase in the protein concentration as we had that additional nitrogen added. And we did see very similar to what they were seeing in New York, around 8 or 9% with nothing added, and up to 18 to 19 when we got up to that high nitrogen rate. And we weren't really seeing any difference between the sulfur or with or without sulfur treatment. And we think that this is mostly because these fields were not limiting in sulfur, so they either had newer on them previously, or they had a fertilizer blend that had sulfur in it, so there was no limiting sulfur yet.
You can do the sulfur analysis on the phone.
No, I don't think so, actually. We should talk about that. So this is just looking at the protein. So like I said, this was the first year. And we, of course, repeated this several years, and it was a little bit disappointing or disheartening. When the second year, we saw a very different scenario play out. Things were very similar with the yield and other quality measures. But for the protein, we saw fairly low actually protein at the central Maryland and a little bit higher at western Maryland. This one was largely because of timing. So for various reasons that we're not going to get into, we had some delays getting that harvested, not by very long, but a few days makes a big difference when we're at a stage of growth. And we were a little tiny bit late there. And so I think that's what happened in this case. And actually the third year, which I don't think I have the data in here, but the third year of this location was higher and more similar to this one, but we didn't see that stepwise increase. We're still playing around with this a little bit. We need to go through the data a little bit more and have all this and tease out what may have been different between these years and why we saw this really nice increase in one year, and then we didn't really see, we didn't have bad protein concentrations, but we didn't see that drastic change that we saw previously. Yeah.
Urea, the source of nitrogen.
Yes.
You state.
Yeah, the urea was our nitrogen source.
We'll go back and look at weather.
Yes. Yeah, weather patterns are something we need to look at for sure. So from the field part of this, the small plot work at least, we did not really see a consistent yield gain with that added nitrogen, which we didn't really expect. We know that fall planting day, fertility in the fall, those things matter much more in terms of yield than any nitrogen in the spring. And then we did see, again, in that 1 year, that nice increase in the protein content of the forage, but then it was much less so the second year. So like I said, we're still playing around with this a little bit. And then I didn't show any of the soil results, but we had very low soil nitrogen concentrations across all the different plots. Anything that we had applied, those things were taking up, and we weren't losing extra nitrogen in the soil. So that was good at least. And then, like I said, we also did this on a larger scale. We wanted to do just not small plot work, we wanted to do a full field scale, so we could actually feed this forage incorporated into dairy cow diets. And at the dairy, we had some larger fields where we couldn't do all 8 movements, because that was too much. So we did just the low, the medium, and the high. So those 3 rates of nitrogen applied to larger 5-acre fields. Using standard equipment that they use on the dairy, everything was harvested around April 26th and then chopped a day or 2 after that. And our different treatments were stored in different ag bags so that we could obviously have it divided up on a slightly smaller scale. I took our quality samples from those after everything had finished fermenting, and we did see, not quite as drastic, but we did still see that stepwise increase from this full field scale. And actually this one, unlike the small plots, this is showing just one of the years, but the other year was very similar. So both years we did the large field scale, we did actually see that kind of stepwise increase in the protein. It was working better on the full field scale than it was in our small plots. I feel like normally it's the opposite, but so that was cool to see that we saw that protein increase. And this forage was then used for a feeding study with the dairy herd at the university. We have an indoor system, so every cow has access to one bump, and they have a little necklace collar that allows them to open the door to their specific feed bump. Talk about adaptation to learn which feed bump of theirs. They try to match them actually from different feeding studies with similar feed bumps. So anyway, that way we could actually measure intake, we could feed each animal individually, we could know what each animal was eating, then producing. And so we essentially set this up to compare it to our corn silage alfalfa ration and balance it for the nutrients. This was like our corn silage alfalfa ration here, this is alfalfa. So you can see corn silage, alfalfa, and then the minerals and other things in there. And then these were our 3 triticale treatments, so the low, medium, and high. And essentially what we did was swapped out the triticale silage for alfalfa silage. and then decrease the amount of soybean meal that we needed based on the protein content of that vertical fluid. Does that make sense? That way everything was balanced and it was a big substitution. And essentially what we saw, so we actually did this replicated this feeding study twice in 2 different years and saw basically the same thing in both years. There was basically no differences in anything, no differences in dry matter intake, no differences in milk yield. We looked at milk protein, other things like that, and saw no differences in any of those either. So essentially what this was telling us is that this is a very doable substitution and you're not going to hurt production or intake or milk yield or anything like that. So that was actually a positive, that we didn't really see any differences, and we were able to conclude that this triticale silage could be used as an alternative to the alfalfa silage without negatively affecting milk production. And so we can hopefully increase the protein of our silage through some different fertilization strategies and then reduce the amount of soybean meal required. And then the part that we're still working on is the economic analysis of this and like looking a little bit more closely at the ration and see how the numbers play out. We're also interested in trying triticale crimson clover or something like that against this triticale with nitrogen to see if maybe we can supply that extra protein in the silage with clover or something like that instead of fertilizer. That would be our next step. We haven't made any progress on that other than talking about it at this point, but it is something that we've talked about. So I think that's my last slide on that one. Yeah.
When you were doing forage analysis, did you look at non-protein nitrogen also as part of that protein?
I have that. I haven't looked super closely at it, but I do have the numbers for it. There's a lot of things I have that I totally looked at that.
Even though sulfur wasn't limiting, I'm wondering if you have less NPN when they treat them with sulfur.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah.
And that's also the value of having the sulfur in the forage because of bacteria. You use that non-protein nitrogen, but they
Yeah.
use the sulfur.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. There's definitely something we need to look at. All right, this is the last one. Current, so we made it also the past, and that's kind of current still, but this is our most current project that we're working on right now. Looking at taking a lot of that work that we did with integrating annuals and trying to answer the question of, is it actually cost effective to plant these annuals? We know it's an expense. We know that our cool season pasture production is not consistent, right? We know we have these big fluctuations throughout the year, but we know that our animals needs are consistent, right? They do have consistent needs. But the question is, how do we fill in those forage gaps? And like we've talked about, one of the ways to potentially do that is by incorporating some annuals in the system, integrating these different types of forages together at different times of the year. And the hope there is that we're improving our forage quality and yield on the same land base and hopefully having a more productive system on the same land base. But like I said, we have to buy seed twice a year for this annual system. We have the planting costs, and we either have the rent drill or own the drill. It takes time to go out and plant. So that all is a monetary factor that we have to think about. There's also a risk factor. What if we have another incredibly dry year and will we plant germinate on time, or we have a sand failure for whatever reason? So there is definitely some risk associated with annual forages. So we wanted to look at this as like a whole system and say, is this worth it? Considering the expenses, considering the risks, or what's our gain from this type of system? And how do we decide if this is worth it or not? So this was set up a little bit like that dairy grazing study, but in this case, instead of the control with the TMR, the control was just like a nice planted perennial pasture, the same pasture mix like our orchard grass, red clover, white clover, a little bit of chicory in there. And in this case, we shifted from using only sheep to using a herd, if you will, a flock herd. So we had 2 mixed species herds of sheep and calves together that were again sourced from a local producer. They were at the research station on a seasonal basis. And this is where we started with the dairy heifer study and this one, we started to get a little more intentional with our moves. So we weren't trying to be as understocked as we were back at that first small limited grazing study. So we were moving these animals usually every 2 or 3 days, sometimes every day, sometimes every 4 days, just kind of forage availability, but much more frequently. And then the perennial annual system was set up very similarly, so similar grazing management. Really the big difference is that they had part of their pasture or that nice same perennial mixed pasture, but a separate part of the pastures were dedicated to annual forages. and had that forage rotation in the mix. And both groups, no one got any extra energy supplementation and PMR or anything like that. They just had access to whatever forage was available and then a mineral, so that we make sure to meet minimum requirements. And again, just showing you the setup of how those annual forages were factored in. We used a lot of different mixes actually in this one. I have a slide at the end if people really want to know about all the mixes we used, but instead of just picking one, people ask us all the time about should we plant, so we were like, let's plant 9 different mixes in these big strips, and then we'll graze the animals perpendicularly to them so they can see which ones they graze the most. And we don't have, it's not an official start of this part of the project, it's a little side project of ours, but it's been really fun for like field days and demonstrations and stuff to show, you know, all these different mixes and how they're being grazed. So same kind of setup, we started in the spring using those winter annuals that were planted the fall before. Then they went to the perennial pasture. The summer annual mixes were planted again around early June and grazed starting early to mid-July. Get a couple months of really good production from those summer annual forages. Again, especially if we have a heavy orchard grass presence in our perennial pastures here at WMREC, and this summer rest was really helpful, especially these last 2 years. It's been really dry. Our orchard grass is much happier in that system than it is in the other system. And then back to the perennial pasture for a little while, back to the annual mixes that we had established in the winter. And again, we actually finished, this was this year, so this was 2024. We wrapped up around mid-November, mostly because the perennial group was out of pasture. We still had several paddocks of the winter annual mixes left for this group, and we actually had a little bit of regrowth on the perennial pasture that we could have gone graze to. I did actually go out and take a bunch of field samples so we could calculate how many grazing days we have been able to get from that perennial pasture. It was, I think, I want to say at least another 3 weeks or so, so could have made it through probably mid-December. Similar to a lot of the other projects, on a bi-weekly basis, we were assessing the animals for body weight, body condition, the Mancha score, collected fecal samples, looked at parasite loads, again, in this project, so it does incorporating those annuals and having that as part of the system affect the parasite pressure for both species, but especially the small ruminants. And then on the opposite weeks, collected again our forage samples, so we have the yield and quality data from all those different pastures. Here's again looking at the forage quality for this project, since it's still ongoing. Some of it, most of this is just averages. I don't have a lot of stats run on this because we're still going through all this, and we have another year of grazing coming up this upcoming year. So these are just average forage quality values from all of 2023 and the first half of 2024. I don't actually have the rest of the samples processed yet and have the data back from those, but this column on the left here is the perennial mixture. That's just the perennial only group. And then these are the different mixes from the group that was using annual forages as well. Again, you can see actually we saw really similar forage quality between the perennial mix in one group and the perennial mix in the other, so that's good, right? And then the annuals again were really providing a lot of really good quality forage. We saw good protein levels, high TDNs from those annual forages, been better than our kind of nice perennial pastures. I don't have a lot of the yield data analyzed or compiled yet, but so here's my picture is worth 1,000 words. And this is the perennial group on the left and the annual group on some cool season annuals on the right. You can see I was forage sampling that day. Where the yield is really gonna differ between these is in that summer production. Especially we've had 2 back-to-back years of really dry, really droughty summers. And so the perennial pastures have struggled along through the drought. But having the animals on these warm season annuals during the heat of that summer has taken a lot of the pressure off of the cool season perennials and has also provided us with a lot of really good summer grazing. I think that's where this system is really going to start to shine, is getting you through the heat of those summer nights. So here's just some initial results from that 2 years, so 2023 and 2024. No difference, so these are the lambs first. There was no difference in body weight at the start or at the end of the grazing season. Like I said, these are just averages for 2024, but no difference probably at the beginning, but there may be more of a difference at the end for this last year, especially if I don't know yet, but we'll see. For lamb body weight, the group on the annuals may have a slightly higher ending body weight. Same thing for average daily gain. There actually was a significant difference in the lamb average daily gain last year with the group that was on the annuals having a higher average daily gain than the perennial group. And this year, again, I haven't analyzed this, but I would expect that to probably be a significantly greater average daily gain as well. Yeah.
How long is the grazing?
So we started grazing right around April 1, and then this year finished in mid-November. In the last summer, we had to end a little bit earlier, the end of September-ish, because things had started off and we didn't have as much forage left. But yeah, generally, start of April through getting into November. April, May, June, July, around 8 months, not quite 8 months.
What was the days of the annual planting when they were ready to graze?
Oh, yeah, actually, I can tell you the exact dates, almost. So these are planted and, the question was, how many days between planting and grazing? These were planted in the fall, so that's maybe not a good example. But these were planted, I think it was like June 2nd or something like that. So it was 6 days before we started grazing the summer annuals. And these were planted, it was like September 10th or something like that, maybe 6 weeks or so. Usually 5-6 weeks is about what we're seeing in terms of planting to grazing, assuming planting conditions are good, you get adequate moisture on time, all this.
I was just thinking in a rotational system, how long I leave that paddock alone, and skip over it.
I can give you the exact date.
Okay.
They were planted on June the 6th and we went in on July the 9th.
There you go. And then the last one for the land. Is the body condition score in 2023, by the end of the grazing season, the annual group did have a significantly higher body condition score, and I'm guessing the same thing is probably true for this past year as well. So really, they're ending with a higher agility, higher body condition, a little bit extra body weight. For the calves, the 2023, their final body weight was simply different, so they again see a greater body weight for the annual group. And I'm expecting or seeing the same trend for this past year in 2024. And average daily gain, this one was not significantly different in 2020, but there might be in 2024, we saw more of a difference this year than we did last year for the calves. And body condition scores, we actually didn't really see any differences in the calves, although this year there may have been a slight increase in body condition for the calves in the annual group. So overall, those annual forages, like I said, were very high quality and high yielding. I focused this on 2023 because that's the year I actually have analyzed so far. But the lands did have a greater average daily gain and body condition score. There was no difference in the Lamatra measurements, and I need to look a little closer, but I don't think in the PLA counts either. This is the first year. And the calves on the annual system did have a greater final body weight. You can see that's an extra, like I have it here, there's an extra 5 to 20 pounds for the lambs and 72 to 134 pounds for the calves by the end of the grazing season for each of the 2 years so far. So we haven't done any of the economics on this yet, but I think there's a lot of potential with, the increased yield and everything that the system, at least so far, is looking very promising. I think that was, my last slide was just mentioning, Jeff said the Forage website, but I do have actually a tab on the website that has research updates, and I've been trying to post, like with a newsletter article or something. I'll try to put an article about the project up there. There's several of the projects that I talked about today do have articles up there that need to be updated. And then we also do a lot of updates on our Facebook page, Maryland Forages. So I post regularly throughout the grazing season, like snapshots of what the animals have been up to and share other things as well. So if you want to follow along as these studies progress, feel free to follow along in that way. And I think I'm a few minutes over. I'm sorry. We had a lot of good questions though. Are there any final good questions other than I know we're moving to growth? Fifth grade and everything's to stretch your legs and get some coffee.
Unless there's something burning, I would suggest that we do.
Yeah, let's take a break.
We'll take
I'll
a
be
break.
around all
Yeah.
day today and tomorrow, and I'm happy to talk to any of you about this stuff. Feel free to find me.